Welcome to the Toldinstone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Roger Crowley. Mr. Crowley, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Garrett. I'm delighted to be talking to you.
Oh, my great pleasure, too. So you've written a whole series of books on early modern Europe, covering everything from the Portuguese Empire to the Venetian Republic. But I want to talk today about your first book, 1453, which explores the Ottoman siege and ultimate capture of Constantinople. This, of course, was far from the first siege that Constantinople had endured. There have been dozens of sieges before, almost often all of them unsuccessful. So could you please get us rolling here by explaining some of the factors that made Constantinople so difficult for medieval armies to capture?
It's a range of factors. One is position, that Constantinople was actually surrounded by water on two sides, and therefore the only bit that you have to defend if your attacker doesn't have a substantial navy is a 4-mile land wall. And the Byzantines also had very effective naval forces. So attack from an enemy really has to be two-pronged. It has to be by land along a fairly short 4-mile length, and by sea. And there were very few armies that came to the city walls in the 1,000 years that the city survived. In fact, it was besieged 25 times in that period. So it lived with sieges about every 40 years on a regular basis. Somebody would turn up and have a go at it. So really, they only had to defend a 4-mile stretch. And that 4-mile stretch was protected by a triple wall, really a masterpiece of Greco-Roman engineering. Consisted of an inner wall, an outer wall, a moat with killing fields between each of these areas. Something like 188 towers over the 4 miles of length, and walls that rose up to 60 feet. Now, nobody had the siege technology to tackle that kind of thing really until the age of gunpowder. And, there are many people who had a crack at it. The Russians came, the Bulgars came, the Avars came, the Arabs came several times. But the technology and the siege skills of the people of Constantinople, because in a sense, this is a city which lived by siege as part of its kind of mental apparatus, and it was well resourced within the city in terms of water supply, and indeed there was land inside the city for growing crops. So it had an official called the Count of the Walls, whose job was to ensure the walls were maintained properly, and really they stocked up for siege as part of the realities of living in this city.
So a whole host of factors, centering on those great triple walls, but the city's position, its internal resources, and even its mentality, all contribute to its resilience in the face of attackers. But of course, in 1453, Byzantium is not what it once was. It's a fragment of an empire, a city-state, essentially, and is encircled by this large, growing empire, the Ottoman Turks. And they have a dynamic young sultan, Mehmed II. Now, in your view, how important was the personality of Mehmed II in driving Ottoman strategy at this point, in driving them to attack Constantinople? Would any young sultan have done the same thing he did, or is this more of a personal matter?
It's a difficult question to answer, actually.
Of course.
There had been previous sieges by Ottoman sultans. There have been 5 sieges, actually. So it was kind of in the DNA of the Ottoman people that they wanted to capture this city. And there were all sorts of regions, both strategic and religious, that related to the sieges that go back to the Arab times, to Islamic prophecy about the glory that would fall upon the Sultan who took the city. So there was a driver within the Ottoman mentality to to target the city. Mehmet, though, comes to it, I think, with a special vigor. He had absorbed the idea of being kind of like an Alexander the Great of the Ottoman Empire. He had indeed had the history of Alexander the Great read to him as part of his, sort of reading matter. And so he inherited an extra special sense of destiny, I think, to take the city and to do what none of his predecessors could do. So he came to it, I think, with a kind of focused mentality and also a very great interest in military engineering. He read Italian books or had Italian books of military theory read to him about siege techniques, about strategic approaches to taking cities. And he was a very bright guy. He thought through all the issues that you have to have a fleet, you've got to cut off supplies coming from up the Black Sea, you've got to gather coherently a large army at the same time, you have to mobilize both in terms of strategic command, but also in terms of raising a sort of jihadi spirit among the Islamic world. So he brought all these forces together, and I think he had a determination that was unmatched by any of his predecessors. I think the city would have fallen in time. I think it was probably inevitable given the balance of power and the way that things were going. But undoubtedly, he was unique in the forensic focus that he brought to trying to take this place.
So we have a young sultan who was especially equipped and especially motivated to capture Constantinople. He's assembled this massive army. He's laid the groundwork for a grand siege. And in the early spring of 1453, he begins marching on the city and arrays forces then just outside the grand land walls. So could you compare for us the forces that Mehmed had at his disposal with those that were inside the walls of the now beleaguered city?
Mehmet had brought together a vast army. It's unfortunately a game that's unwinnable in trying to count Islamic armies. I mean, conventionally, Christians will always say there are 200,000 people. What comes to the siege are his regular army, volunteers, people conscripted, Christians from the Balkan states, but also a huge logistical corps. A vast amount of baggage, animals, people who are going to put up tents, people who are going to provide supplies. And we think of the Ottomans as great fighters, but they were also very good bean counters. They were very good at managing the logistics of war, the supplies that you need. And so probably he might have had a fighting army of about 60 to 80,000 men, but a sort of support corps that could be double that. So if you were looking out from the walls of the city, you would see this vast array of human beings, tents, horses, camels, animals, equipment, which would have, blown the minds of the defenders, but would have certainly probably increased their estimation of the forces that they were fighting by at least double. I would say that he probably had 80,000 men. But as the Battle of Agincourt, fought at the same time and was a major battle, only involved 35,000 men, this is kind of an extraordinary number of people. On the Christian side, well, it wasn't that difficult to count them because that's just what Constantine did, and it came to something like 7,851 men. He was slightly hampered in this because of doctrinal trouble within Constantinople over the relationship with the Catholic Church. Quite a number of the Greeks would not fight because of the dispute between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Church in Rome. But we know that he really had a very, very small army. And this was made up of local Greek forces, of mercenaries from Italy, resident Venetians, and among these were one or two kind of quite valuable people. A siege engineer, Genoese siege engineer called Giovanni Giustiniani, who was a very, very skilled siege defensive expert and was an extremely valuable man. So the numbers are obviously completely disparate between the two sides, but what they had was a reasonably motivated. In fact, you've got volunteers, rather like fighting the Spanish Civil War or something. People came from, across Europe. There were Spanish people there. There was even a Scottish mining engineer there. We never worked out what he was doing, but who came to defend the walls. So it had a small, reasonably elite force, I think, of people, but the difference between the number of people involved was huge.
Okay. So the defenders are outnumbered something like 10 to 1, even though they are highly motivated and quite skilled. And the Ottomans have this vast force at their disposal. They array themselves outside the land walls, which are 1,000 years old, despite many repairs. And so what are, in Mehmed's initial estimation, the weakest points in this vast circuit of walls?
Everybody knew, and past sieges had known, that in the middle of the walls there's a river called the River Lycos, and it's funneled down into a valley. And at that point, the walls do not have a great superiority over the surrounding land, so they're comparatively quite low there. Also, because of the water that comes into the city, which is actually probably quite important from the water supply point of view, it makes it very difficult to dig a decent moat. So, if you are on the Ottoman side, you're not quite level with the top of the land walls, but the distance between the depth, the height of the land walls, and the ground around has shrunk by quite a lot. So this is one of the key points. The other key point: this is a triple wall, inner wall, outer wall, moat with killing zones between them. But at the northern end, because of the terrain, there is only, and it's quite rocky there, there is only a single wall, a little bulge that goes out to the Golden Horn, and there is no moat. So that is also another area for the any defending siege team to attack. But effectively, they're going to concentrate their fire on this middle section of the wall with the valley.
Okay. And so with these weaknesses in mind, with their forces arrayed, the siege finally begins. And it is, of course, everyone knows it's a big deal. It's an epical event. But our textual sources, what I understand, are surprisingly both, say, scanty and difficult to use. Why is that?
It's a very good question, actually. And I think it results in a large amount of holes in understanding of the siege. I think on the Ottoman side, because that's an easy one to answer, there is no history of writing first-hand accounts, almost. I mean, if you try to read the Ottoman sources, they go into this kind of flowery language about, it's completely useless when you're as a historian trying to find out this is a big deal for them. This is a big event in their history.
Right.
And you get something like the flower of Islam slew the infidel at the gates of felicity. Yeah, this is great, but actually doesn't help us very much. And there's only one first-hand source from the Ottomans, which is when one of the sheikhs says to Mehmed, "You're going to lose this siege unless you get your act together." On the Christian side, they were kind of probably quite busy defending the walls. But there are about 6 or 7 sieges of varying degrees of authenticity and usefulness. There was an Italian Venetian doctor there called Nicola Barbaro, who wrote a diary. There are about 3 or 4 other guys of Ducas, George Francis, a rather kind of confused account by a Russian Orthodox guy called Iskander. It's made more complicated because George Francis wrote an account, and then there's another account which is really good, and people have used this a lot. And then they discovered that it was a forgery, about 200 years later. There are some people standing back a little way who are not involved in the siege. Christovolulus of Imbros is one, and one or two others, but who obviously collect information quite effectively afterwards. But the amount of first-hand stuff, and also because of course we have to say that a lot of people did not survive, who would have provided.
Right.
So a lot of the time you're reading between the lines, actually. And if you read the Turkish accounts, which I have done rather slowly, they rest almost entirely on the Christian sources. And it is absolutely frustrating, that we don't know more. So you're picking your way through the terrain of what people say, of what they think they say, of what you can deduce from the evidence on the ground. But it remains frustrating, and there are an awful lot of holes, quite mysteries in here, which I'm afraid we'll never find out. It would help if the Turkish government ever allowed some archaeology just outside the walls. Outside the walls in the old ditches, they now grow vegetables, and they could dig them up and find out. But I don't know what it is. There's something sort of, I don't know what it is. It's something technical and not technical, but ideological somehow in what they want to know, what they want to find out. Archaeology would help us, I think, but it's obviously not going to give us the first-hand stories. The first-hand stories that we have are quite good, and quite gripping. But you are kind of trying to work your way through this, really. I think that the fact that many of the first-hand witnesses to this did not survive, really, if more people had got away, we'd probably have had more information. But it is frustrating.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. And actually, I do know as an ancient historian, you have a few voices echoing in the dark, and you want so much more. You want a chorus.
Yeah, you always want more, yeah.
Right. So from what we do know, and of course, there's the caveats that we don't know much about many critical bits of this siege. Gunpowder is critical, as you mentioned earlier, that it's the element that allows these ancient land walls to finally be breached. And there's an engineer on the Ottoman side named Urban, apparently, a Hungarian, it seems, maybe German, who builds these very large cannons. I think you call them super guns in your book. How pivotal for the success of the Ottoman siege are these enormous cannons?
I think the Orban, who actually offered his services to Constantine first, but Constantine didn't have the money, unfortunately, to employ him. I think that there's one enormous gun you called the Basilica, the Great Cannon, which was constructed in a forge at a city called Edirne, about I can't remember, 100 miles away, and extraordinarily expensive to make. And this gun is brought to the walls. Overall, we think that the Ottomans had about 70 cannon of different sizes. Undoubtedly, there was a kind of psychological aspect to this super gun. Mehmed made it quite announced to the Byzantines that this thing is coming. It's coming for you. So there's a lot of propaganda around this. We don't really know, but I think Orban, with this gun, with its half-ton stone balls and so on, was working at the limits of metallurgy. And we do know that it fired for a certain amount of time and then it cracked. And I suspect that the real damage was done by the slightly smaller cannon working in teams. They'd have two slightly smaller cannons and a big cannon trying to aim in a kind of V shape called the bear and cubs to try and chisel away a piece of wall. What is critical to the success of their cannon is that they can keep them firing, and they keep them firing for nearly 50 days, 40 something days, 47 days.
Mm-hmm.
And this is remarkable. And this is the feat of logistics, really, that they had gathered together all the resources for and a supply chain of gunpowder, cannonballs. The cannonballs were constructed by masons on the shores of the Black Sea, brought over in ships. They would have been ordered to certain diameters, and to create that ability to continue to supply your cannon with ammo and with gunpowder, really, so that they kept firing, was extraordinary. They also had on-site metal foundries, small-scale foundries, where they could repair small cannons. Extraordinary. And most of the scrap bronze that came for the to use these cannon was the result of melting down the church bells of the Balkans. It's like turning your plowshares back into swords.
Right.
If you want to put it like that. So really, it was the fact that they could keep firing for such a long period. And I think that the super gun probably didn't fire for all that long, but it was just the intensity and the continuation of the firing, and the kind of psychological pressure that this put on the defenders. They'd never seen anything like this before, and it just went on and on, day after day. It was a remarkable achievement.
So it's less about one Big Bertha style gun and more just this constant barrage that went on and on for more than a month. And of course, the psychological impact, as you said. So given their very limited resources, how effective was the Byzantines' plan of defense against this constant barrage and the vast besieging army?
It was surprisingly effective. They made quite a lot of holes in the walls. We think about 7 or 8, and some of them in the end were about 30 yards long. But Giustiniani came up with what was a pretty good solution, really, which was to fill in the walls with timber and with earth. And the effect that this had really was that the impact by creating a sort of a stockade that was faced with stone and mud. Effectively, they absorb the velocity of impact of the cannonballs quite well. It's like sort of throwing a stone into mud, and this was actually a pretty good, defense. So it enabled, it required a non-stop effort by the whole city. Women and children would come lugging up these great these baskets of earth to carry out the repairs. Obviously, exhausting, continuous business. But this method of repairing the walls worked pretty well and was continuously frustrating. They would dump wicker baskets on top to provide crenellated battlements to hide behind and shoot out from. So Giustiniani's defense technique was really quite successful and very frustrating that they couldn't easily make a clear breach in the walls to have a go at. So yeah, it worked quite well.
So thanks to the efforts of Giustiniani and the other captains and the high morale inside the city, they managed to hold off the Ottomans for what seems like quite a long time, at least to Mehmed, who had wanted to take the city almost immediately. And he focuses, eventually, on the Golden Horn, which had been protected by a great chain from his own fleets. He says he decides he has to take this over and create a larger front for the defenders to try to defend.
Yeah.
So you talk a bit about how he takes the Golden Horn and about how significant this is for the progress of the siege.
This is one of the great mystery gaps in the story, I think. The Golden Horn was closed by a chain by the defenders. And Mehmet stunned the the Christians by arriving with quite a reasonable fleet, mainly made up of Greeks who can impress Greeks. And there was a sea battle off the walls in which Mehmed's fleet was roundly defeated or failed to capture the rest of ships that had arrived to provide supplies. And he had a harbour a little bit further up the Bosphorus, and of the two seaward sides, on the other side, the Marmaris side, it was extremely difficult to make a landing because the currents are quite strong there. But the Golden Horn was a placid water. So he really wanted to, if he could break the chain or get behind the chain, this would force defenders away from the wall. They'd have to defend another 3 or 4 miles of wall, and this would be strategically helpful and might help for him to ferry men across more easily. According to the legend as it goes, on the other side of the Golden Horn, there was a Genoese town called Galata. And the Genoese were kind of playing a double game. They were kind of neutral, sitting in the middle, really not knowing what to do. But behind this, as far as the story goes, Mehmed had a very large supply and support corps that he put a number of his ships, and I can't remember how many it was now. I can't remember if 20 or 40, but it was quite a fair number, on greased planks, and had them hauled up behind Galata and into the Golden Horn, all in one night. Now, if you do that now, it's quite a steep climb from the site up through Istanbul's main shopping street. Yeah, it's quite a steep thing, right. And then down the other side. And the mystery is how he could do this in secrecy. So that on the following morning, when the defenders looked out of the from the sea walls, they saw these ships being rolled into the Golden Horn. How had they not found out about it? How had the Genoese not told them? And nobody really knows. The ergonomics involved in this are perplexing. I mean, yes, they were very good at practical engineering, the Ottomans, and they had, as I say, a very large labour corps. But it's still likely that actually they didn't do that, that they had these are galleys, they're not huge ships, taken to pieces, carried up and reconstructed. And this has been done in other places. The Venetians had done it in lakes in Italy. So, but we really don't know. And it forms part of the heroic story as far as the Ottomans and Turks are concerned. Great pictures of these ships being hauled up, by teams of men and oxen. They might have done it, but we just don't know. Right. But it was strategically quite important because it certainly spooked the defenders, very badly. And the following night, they set out in the dark to make a midnight attack on this small flotilla of ships. And somehow it seems that they were betrayed by somebody within the Genoese town, probably by a signal from the big tower there, which is still there, called the Galata Tower. And the surprise was undone. The counterattack was incredibly successful. Ships were sunk, men were captured, and then the following morning impaled on stakes outside the walls to freak out the defenders. So it was a masterstroke of strategy by Mehmed, and undoubtedly tipped the balance both in morale and in terms of the disposition of forces quite effectively. It was a great move.
Okay, so now that the Ottomans control the Golden Horn, the defenders have an increasingly long front to defend. And yet the walls stubbornly refuse to fall. And so Mehmed decides, in yet another attempt to create more stress for the defenders, to try to dig beneath them with these German miners he has at his disposal. Can you talk a bit about this attempt to undermine the walls and about how significant it was, again, in kind of bringing the city to its knees?
It's an interesting one, that, and one that I haven't thought about in a great deal of detail until you raised it. But conventionally, mining had always been, certainly within the Arab tradition, one of the most effective ways of taking a city. If you look at Saladin and, the undermining, they were very, very good at mining technology, and they had these silver miners from the Balkans. Partially, I think that geology was not on their side. I think the terrain was probably quite rocky. The ground was open, and it was. They couldn't conventionally. I think with the sieges, what you do is you edge your way up as close as you can by advancing, putting up screens, and then the closer you get, the easier the tunneling becomes. They, for one reason or another, they were incapable of doing this effectively until later on in the siege. It seems that the miners were only brought into play quite late on, and they were successful in creating some tunneling under the walls. I mean, the aim of tunneling is not actually to get in to put people inside. It's a very ineffective way of, one man at a time popping out of a tunnel. It is to make a large chamber under the walls, get some wood in there, set fire to it, bring down the wall. But this is a triple defensive line, and so you've got to do this several times. They obviously did manage to get under the walls, but the countermining was very effective. This Scottish siege engineer, Duncan Grant, had an effective method of detecting earth disturbance underground. They used to put down buckets of water, and any kind of ripple on the surface would be a detection device as to the fact there's something going on. And Duncan, David Grant, I think he was, got countermining in there, counterminers in there, and with the element of surprise, they managed to pull down the tunnels, and effectively mining proved to be ineffective. I think at this stage, Mehmet was getting desperate because he also tried another very old-fashioned siege technology, which was, wheeled towers, which are very vulnerable. And, even if you cover them in goat skin or something that was meant to, they were quickly destroyed. So these feel like sort of last-ditch attempts to, you have to say that the convention in Islamic siege warfare is that they always went for the quick knockout blow, because you bring people to the wall, and you rally people in a spirit of jihad, for this this great thing, and you can only keep the enthusiasm of people going for a certain amount of time, and conventionally it was about 4 weeks and there are Islamic siege manuals on this, really, but also the logistics. If you do the logistics of providing food, latrine facilities, fodder for horses, it becomes dangerous after about 4 weeks in terms of disease outbreaks, typhoid and waterborne diseases and so on. Although the Ottomans, like their Islamic predecessors being nomadic people, they were extremely good at camping. They understood the rules of, unlike Christian armies, which were totally chaotic when they set up camp. They were really well organized, and remove the excrement, provide clean water and so on. You can only manage that for a certain period of time. And Mehmet knew after about 4 weeks, 6, 7 weeks, that he was running out of time and the patience of his men. And part of the lure for a lot of volunteers was the idea of booty, that you were going to get, and therefore keeping these people together, even if they're driven by the spirit of jihadi fire and prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad, they can only be kept there a certain period of time. So both the mining and the siege engines look like things that actually this is getting a little bit desperate, and neither of those work terribly well. So in the end, you're going to have to rally your men for a concerted all-out attack. I mean, they had made attacks on the breaches along the way, but they've been continuously driven out, and sometimes there have been counter forays by Justiniani's men, raids to keep them out. And critical to that is you have to fill in the moat, and they put in a lot of effort in doing that, hurling in anything they could, dead bodies, dead horses, bits of wood, anything they could find to create a bridge, because you had to drop down about 7 feet along the bottom and then climb up again, which makes you incredibly vulnerable. So a lot of effort towards the end would have gone into filling up the moat so that you can at least get to the first proper line of defense in reasonable time at a reasonable speed. So by the time we get to 40 something days, it's really time that you've either got to do it or you've got to give back. And with a lot at stake for Mehmed in this. This is a very high risk strategy for him. Young Sultan, you have to legitimize your Sultan by a victory. He had been for a short time Sultan before, because his father had abdicated, and he'd made a complete mess of it, and his father had to come back. So this is dangerous for Mehmed. He could possibly be killed and replaced by actually, he was the only surviving brother, so I don't know what would have happened. But this is a high-risk strategy for him. So after 45 days, he's really got to go for it, psych the men up to fight, and it's all or nothing.
So this final do or die, no holds barred, final assault takes place on Tuesday, May 29th, 1453. So his men are lined up, they're keyed up to fever pitch, and the assault finally begins in the early morning hours. Can you walk us through these next few hours, the critical hours, as the assault washes over the defenses of Constantinople?
Yeah, everybody knows it's coming. They know it's coming from in the walls. There have been 3 days. They've seen 3 days of fasting and feasting, a ring of fire at night, and they know this is coming. The Christians go in for a final church service in the great mother church of Hagia Sophia, and the sides prepare themselves for battle. Yes, the Ottomans have psyched their men up with the imams going through the troops, promising them, that paradise will await them. There are great promises of rewards for the first man up the walls, and they're ready to go. Within the walls, ditto, they have prepared themselves. They have psyched themselves up. They have paraded their most holy icons along the city walls. They have worked out that as everybody's aware, that this attack is going to take place in this middle section where the river is, about 1,000 yards long. By this time, the number of men available to Constantine is about 2,000. He cannot really afford to man the whole wall, so it's lightly defended along either ends and not much along the seashore. So he's really marched most of his men. There's a double wall, the inner wall and the outer wall, and he knows that there is no going back. So what he does is he marches his men into this critical sector of about 1,000 yards, something like that. 2,000 men, and between the inner and the outer walls, they have only ever really been able to defend the walls, the outer wall, because they didn't have enough men to defend the depth defense inner wall. But to do or die with and the door into the city through the inner wall is locked behind them, so they're going to go down. What Mehmet does conventionally is all sieges begin with a great wall of noise. They have a complete military band there, trumpets, drums, which is really to kind of inspire people and drive the fear out of them. But being what he is, you send out your troops in order of their ascendancy of usefulness. So you send out the volunteers or the conscripts first. These are kind of the cannon fodder. And really, it's really just sending out waves of men to be mown down. First of all, your volunteers or your Christian conscripts who have been ordered to the siege. Then your infantry who are subjects of the Sultan, who own land from him and therefore are beholden to him, and these are quite highly trained men. And behind that, you have your crack troops, your janissaries, and so you're just going to send wave after wave of men out into the line of fire, and really just attritional. You wear them down. So the first wave rush forward. There are about, I think, 7 or 8 gaps in the walls, which they're aiming for. For the first, this begins early in the morning, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock before dawn. The defenders do pretty well. The first wave is slaughtered, just to make sure nobody turns tail from the Ottoman side. Behind this cannon fodder lair, he has men with swords and chains to whip them back into battle. So it's a kind of right, yeah. We're going to climb up over your dead bodies, mate, when it comes down to it. And really for quite a long time the Christians do extremely well, but obviously this is exhausting, and there is attrition of people, and his calculation, Mehmet, is that he will in the end just wear down, but it's getting desperate. The first line go, the second line do make it into do make a breach into the through the outer wall, but get massacred and pushed back, and it's going to get to a point when he's going to have to call up his janissaries, his track troops to, this is it. If they don't do it, but two things happen really, which really spook the defense. And one is that there's a certain amount, I think, of there's a certain amount of sorties taking place from the walls, from little little gates out to drive people back. And it's said that up towards the northern end, which is the end where there's only a single wall, somebody left a gate open, and a small number of Turks managed to get in and get up onto the wall and plant a banner. And this kind of is a morale, incredibly damaging for morale. They're not there for very long. They're driven off, but it kind of it spooks the defense. The second thing that happens is that Justiniani, who is undoubtedly exhausted by the his incredibly effective siege management over this so many weeks, gets hit by a bullet, and we don't know exactly where. There's no visible wound, but probably just under his breastplate. And he knows that this is serious. Nobody else can see it. Mehmet Constantine has the key around his neck. Giovanni Giustiniani says, I can't fight on. I need to go. I need medical help. And Constantine says, well, if you go, we're lost. But Giustiniani, I think his morale had probably gone. He said, I can't fight. I'm dying. I'm a dying man. So reluctantly, Constantine opens the gate, and it's one narrow gate, about an ordinary gate, and of course the defense, when they see the kind of iconic commander leaving the field of battle, as Constantine recognized, they panic. There's only one small exit from this trap. They're trapped within these walls. And at that point, the defense collapses, and the Ottomans then are able to get up onto the walls a bit further up and down, and get onto the inner wall behind. And so Constantine's men are then completely trapped and massacred within this enclosed arena, and it's all over. The whole thing is just over. And most of them are killed. Some people get away. Constantine just disappears and is never seen again. And the siege is over by probably about 10 o'clock in the morning, 11 o'clock in the morning. And then they start to work their way into the city, and the defense collapses. There are no troops within the city. There are no, there's no further resistance. And then they can get in over the ships in the Golden Horn can land. They can land people, and so they can converge on the city from all sides and get into the center of the city, and eventually get right into the center of the city. Right in the heart of the city, the great Mother Church of Hagia Sophia. There are over 10,000 people. It is a huge building, and I believe there could well have been 10,000 men, women, and children sheltering in there. The door is battered open, and they're captured. And for a while, there's a massacre, but not for very long, because the Ottomans realize that there is no resistance, and slaves are valuable, so you might as well start enslaving people rather than killing them and looting. They're starting to look for all this fantastic treasure that they've been told they're going to find. I mean, really, I think, as you said at the beginning, this city is a shadow of what it was in its heyday, and a lot of the gold and stuff is gone, but there's probably still quite a lot of stuff knocking around for people to. But people might be the main, might be the most valuable thing that you're going to get from it, and so that is the end of 1,000 years of this extraordinary Christian city.
Yeah, so so the city falls infamously. Now, if Giustiniani hadn't been hit by that bullet, all these great ifs of history, if the Cargo Porta hadn't been breached, if the Janissaries hadn't come over the wall, if this assault had failed, do you think Mehmed would have, at that point, called the siege off, come back next year? Of course, it's all hypotheticals, but your sense of how desperate he was.
I think he would he'd have to call the siege off. I think there would have been a crisis within the Ottoman state. As I said earlier, this is quite risky for him. It's quite possible that he might have been killed, and then something completely different would have happened. I think he himself would not have given up. I mean, as long as he could somehow retain his legitimacy as Sultan, he would have to have come back again. And we have to say, when you look at the situation, you look at the the disparity of manpower, you look at the state of the city, then you look at the fact that probably nobody attempts to get the papacy to send resources. was dependent upon submission to the Catholic Church, and the Greeks were never going to do that. There was a point at which some of the Greeks said, rather the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat. They were kind of on another plane as far as theology was concerned. So sooner or later, it was going to be over for this city. It couldn't survive as a Christian city. It was inevitable. So whether Mehmet was in a position to come back the following year, or whether he was dead, we don't know. I suspect he probably would be in a position because he was kind of powerful and resourceful. It would have just been another year. It would have been another time.
But of course, it does fall in 1453, and Mehmed, takes the city as his new capital, moving there from Edirne, and soon begins to consider himself the heir, apparently, of the Byzantine emperors. Calls himself Roman Emperor in some of his correspondence with the European states. In your opinion, this of course is just a matter of opinion, does he have some justification in the way he rules and how he presents himself as being a sort of successor to the Byzantine emperors?
It's an interesting one, that. I think the Ottomans and indeed his successors are obsessed by this title of Caesar. I mean, I suppose you could say that they were inheriting most of the footprint of the Eastern Roman Empire. Asia Minor, down to Egypt and North Africa, along the Black Sea, into the Balkans. So I think, in terms of territorial footprint, you could say that the Ottomans had inherited, Byzantium. I mean, obviously not in its great heyday of, Justinian and so on, when they ring the Mediterranean, although the Ottomans did fairly well on that, certainly on the southern shore. So I think, just in terms of territory, yes, they probably could claim it. I don't quite know what the full credentials for being Caesar are, really.
Oh, right.
I mean, after all, Constantine was not, well, he was effectively emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, and that's what Mehmet was. So you could say, yes, he was. Yes, he was inheriting that. Obviously, he's not inheriting one of the core elements of Byzantium, which is the Christian religion, and therefore, from that point of view, although obviously, per se, if you take Caesar as the whole Roman thing, half of it is pagan. But certainly, if you talk about the Eastern Roman Empire, you are talking about a Christian faith, and culturally different from the Western Roman Empire. And I think part of the trouble between the papacy in Rome and the patriarch in Constantinople, although it was to do with theology, the liturgy, and the role of the papacy, a lot of it this was cultural, quite honestly. These are different people. I mean, when the Crusaders turned up, in 1098, they were astonished and aghast at at Eastern Christianity. These were people. These were Middle Eastern people. They're not Europeans. They're different people. But so I don't know. I think you could probably make a reasonable case, yes, that he was, because he was inheriting it, he could call himself Caesar, and he was desperate to be called Caesar.
Right.
He was, and Suleiman the Magnificent, really wanted to make a picture of getting Rome, which he failed to do. But,
right.
So, yeah.
Well, great. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Mr. Crowley, for going through all this. It's one of these pivotal moments in European history, Byzantine history, Ottoman history, the history of Eurasia, really. And it's nice to have it in detail, despite all these gaps in our knowledge.
Have you ever been to Istanbul, Garrett?
I have. Yes, I did. I was there
Mhm.
just about a few weeks ago. I
Oh,
had
were
a bit of
you?
a trip in that, and
Right.
actually, as part of my trip, I walked along the land walls, and was still astonished by. They're heavily restored, of course, in places, but the scale is still very impressive.
Could you walk along the land walls? I thought
Um,
they tried to seal them off.
yeah, or I should say, not along on top of, kind of on the outside, like by that.
Walking along outside it. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right, like by the garden
yeah,
belt and where the
yeah.
moat was, and
Yeah. No,
yeah, there's.
absolutely. I mean, you obviously got a sense of what
Mhm.
this was. It is a bit weird the way they've rebuilt it, but it gives you a good sense, doesn't it? Actually, of what these were. They
It
were a
does.
fantastic piece of work.
You know,
Absolutely
that
fantastic.
they have
Yeah.
the old Golden Gate is the Yeti Kule, I guess, it is open as a museum, and you can go up on top of there, and there you can kind of see the wall stretching off towards the Sea of Marmara on the one
Have they
side.
reopened? Have they reopened
They
it?
have, yes, just I think a
Because
few years
when I was
ago.
there, last year, it was still closed. Actually, I really like going up on the top there. I think
Hmm.
that's one of the best places to see the walls, isn't it?
Oh,
Actually,
it is. Yeah, and it was, of course, a
uh,
howling wind coming off the sea, but when I could stand up, it was a beautiful view.
yeah, this time of the year it can be a bit parky
Oh
up there,
yeah.
but yeah, I
Um,
mean, I think the great thing about going to this city is that actually you can relive the siege. Quite
mhm,
honestly, you can go to Hagia Sophia where they all
mhm,
you can go past the monument of Constantine outside the Grand Bazaar,
mhm.
where an angel with a flaming sword was going to turn back the
Right.
infidel, but unfortunately failed to do it on that day. You can see the sea walls. I don't know if you went up the Golden Horn in a boat, but
Mhm,
it's because of its configuration, because it is surrounded by water on two sides, and you can't get any urban sprawl within the city, really,
mhm,
and the areas, the the middle way they call it, the main street with which the tram
mhm.
goes up, with created by Constantine,
Right, right.
um, and the footprint of those of the web of main arteries go right back to Constantine. It's the urban structure is still pretty much intact.
Mhm.
So it is absolutely fascinating. Actually, did you manage to go down a Byzantine cistern?
Oh yes, yeah. No, I had
Yeah,
so the Basilica cistern, of course, and the what Binbir Durek sister, and so I went down to the two big ones, and I
yeah,
hadn't been down
yeah,
there. I went down the first time I was in Istanbul, years and years ago, and I hadn't been
yeah,
since. And
yeah,
they've
yeah.
really, as I'm sure you've seen, they've really done quite a job making the atmospheric lighting down there in the Basilica Sister, and it's
Yeah,
quite a
I'm not
fun
quite sure
thing.
whether I like it or not, but it's
Yeah.
in a way it's quite dramatic, isn't it? Actually, I love those systems. I think they're just so fantastic.
Oh, they're
Actually,
great. Yeah, just those endless lines of columns. But yeah, you get a sense
yeah,
again of the scale of Byzantine city, and like you said, that you can go down, the Divan Yolu, right? Just as they may say. Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and
there's a whole subterranean world under the hippodrome there.
mhm.
Apparently, you can float around under there in boats. There's a whole
Oh,
under
right,
there. I mean, it is a tell, in terms of
right, right, yeah.
yeah, one layer on top of another.
Hmm.
Actually, really, really, really fantastic.
Um,
Yeah, good show.
but uh, but anyway, yeah. Well, thank you so much for going through all this. To everyone listening, 1453 and Roger Crowley's other books are available wherever books are sold. Check them out. And again, Roger, thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gareth. It's always a pleasure to talk about this, and I'll I'll check out your podcast and try not to listen to my bit.
All right. Well, thanks so much, and to
Yeah.
everyone, thanks for listening.